This is Professor Marsh again. This is the lecture presentation for Unit 7, Principles of Management, Newberry College, Fall 2021. Unit 7 is Chapter 7 in the 10th edition of our textbook, and Chapter 8 in the 11th edition on managing human resources, with the updating of a few examples and the addition of a very important additional section in the 11th edition, which I have posted, by the way, in your materials for this unit. The additions are nearly identical. But to read the additional, if you've got the 10th edition of the textbook, please look at the course work for this unit and read the additional section on diversity. Uh, so this is one of the few chapters in which there has been a substantial addition and a real improvement in the treatment that the book gives these materials. And the HR sector of business management is one of the most dynamic and interesting areas of business today. Many consulting companies are making very good money advising businesses of all sizes on how to avoid the many dangers, traps, and regulatory hurdles necessary in today's business world. This is a good area for both lawyers and business people to focus, given the high price of mistakes in human resource management. The module at the end of the chapter was also substantially updated and improved and has some relevance to the topic of your first paper. So I will post the updated module so that you all have it. Okay, key components in the human resource management process and important influences. Uh, First of all, we typically refer to human resource management as HRM, or human resources. Sometimes we refer to the department as HR. There's an exhibit number 1 in your chapter, either uh, 8-1 in the 11th or 7-1 in the 10th, um, that shows the human resource management process, which is a little bit like looking at a bowl of spaghetti and trying to figure out which string belongs to which other one. Uh, Legal environment of HRM, major HRM laws. That's Exhibit 2 in the unit. Industrial psychology. That's an important term. That's the science of HRM, and we're going to look at global human resource laws. And human resource management is the management function concerned with getting, training, motivating, and keeping competent workers. Uh, and I think Exhibit 8-1 or 7-1, depending on the edition, it's too darn complicated to be very useful in studying. Just look at it, read the captions in the boxes, and keep moving along. There's better stuff later in the chapter. I studied labor relations law back in law school back in 1980, and I did very well. I got an A in the course. Uh, Look at exhibit number 2 in the chapter, um, and the list of the major HRM laws. This may be why I did so well back in 1980. Less than half of the major HRM laws were enacted prior to 1980. The rest are all newer than that. So I didn't have as much to study back then. Sadly for you, there's lots of laws governing HR now, and the penalties for violating them are really severe. Note the definition of affirmative action programs. Those are programs that ensure that decisions and practices enhance the employment, upgrading, and retention of members of protected groups. The list of major HRM laws is pretty interesting, and I've had experience working with many of them in practice, even the ones that I didn't study in law school. Nowadays, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is institutionalized with the need to make reasonable accommodations for disabled or chronically ill employees or customers. HIPAA protects healthcare privacy as well as permitting employees to keep employer provided insurance for up to 18 months after terminating employment, whether you quit or get fired or retire. That can be important. Note that in Sweden, when they have the box on global HR laws, Sweden has required family leave of 480 days per couple, which they can split up any way they choose. So that could be as much as over 2 years of work days in Sweden. That way, one parent can stay at home with the kids. At least one parent can stay home with the kid until he's 2 years old and can go to kiddie daycare. Although my understanding from my children and grandchildren is that kiddie daycare actually can start at 6 months, or perhaps earlier in some cases. Industrial psychology is the science that seeks to improve the performance and well-being of workers and the functioning of the organization. Note the name Hugo Munsterberg. You will encounter it again if you go into the HR field. Okay, identifying and selecting competent employees. And employment planning. These are the topics in identifying and selecting competent employees. Employment planning deals with how managers ensure they have the right number and right kind of employees in the right place at the right time. We're going to talk about a human resource inventory in this chapter. It's a report, an important report. Determining future employee needs. What are our goals and revenue growth? What's the supply and demand conditions for our products? What do we expect to need not just today, but what do we expect for the future? Recruiting employees. Note exhibit number 3 in the chapter, advantages and disadvantages of different sources of recruiting. And a lot of recruiting now is done electronically on the computer, either through websites or by other means of disseminating the job listings and job openings. And that's very important today. Almost every company that I'm aware of has, at least on its website, a box or tab in which it lists available jobs. And today, as you probably know, there are more jobs available in the economy than there are workers collecting unemployment. And so it's a time in which additional workers are needed and which jobs are plentiful. That's certainly not always the case, but it's the situation in today's market. This section 2B is how to handle layoffs and note the downsizing options. And the number 3 is the selection process. How do we come up with a selection process for identifying and selecting the employees to hire that'll be accurate, reliable, and have valid criteria. So note the ethical decision at the beginning of this section. In the 11th edition, there's a very thoughtful series of questions about the confusion on how to deal with state versus federal laws regarding marijuana and the drug and alcohol policies that companies have in place to protect worker and customer safety. It can get very complicated, especially for workers who have been prescribed medical marijuana for anti-nausea cancer treatments or for PTSD. How might this conflict with ADA requirements? How would your drug and alcohol policies be consistent for workers who have medical marijuana prescribed to them? It's a real conundrum regarding employers and HR departments to stay totally up to date. And by the way, South Carolina is one of only 4 states in which weed is still totally illegal. There's no medical, no recreational, nothing. So if you were to look on a chart of the states, you'd find that South Carolina, along with, I think it's Georgia and Wyoming, and maybe Idaho are the only four states which have not had any reform in their marijuana laws. Note the concept of human resource inventory. That's a report listing important information about each employee, such as name, education, training, skills, language competency. And what we're talking about here is hopefully everyone has English language competency, but this is to identify people who speak foreign languages and who might be able to assist with workers in other locations, perhaps assist with customers for whom English is a secondary or perhaps not really a language that they deal with. It can be very helpful in assessing an organization's or business unit's labor resources. Job analysis is an assessment that describes the jobs and behaviors necessary to perform them. A job description, you've probably heard that term before, that's a written statement that describes a job. Job specification is a written statement of minimum qualifications necessary to perform a given job successfully. You might even ask that question, what are the job specifications for this position? Recruitment. That is the process of locating, identifying, and attracting capable applicants. Layoffs, well, we've heard of layoffs, but I think the book really does a good job of noting the downsizing options. You don't have to just fire everyone. You have alternatives which might preserve the relationship that the organization wants to have with capable employees, even though there's a downturn in business. Temporary layoffs, hiatuses, reduced work weeks, job sharing. For some employees who are going to be leaving the workforce, you might do some buyouts. If you're a multi-unit business, you might transfer the worker to another unit which doesn't have the same downturn and then try to get them back. Note the very simple matrix of selection decision outcomes in Exhibit 8-5 in the 11th edition or Exhibit 7-5 in the 10th edition and the concept of reject error and accept error. It's sort of like false positives and false negatives from statistics, alpha errors and beta errors. You want your selection criteria to be tested and be both reliable and valid. Tests, forms, interviews, or other criteria need to be able to identify which applicants can successfully perform the job. You might use performance simulation tests. Performance simulation tests. Getting the applicant to actually perform the job function as a test. Think of an audition for a role for an actor. So that's a performance simulation test, a classic one, and one which you can apply perhaps to some other businesses. When we hire, particularly when we hire administrative or even paralegal employees, we often will give them a short test of, might include some calculation functions, some math functions that are important to our work as tax attorneys, maybe even a typing test. Nowadays, most professionals themselves take courses on, usually I don't know what they're called now, keyboarding or some kind of information technology course that teaches you how to interact with a computer keyboard. But your administrative employees sometimes don't have those skills either, and so it's important to identify them, especially if you're expecting them to help you with word processing functions or correspondence on the job. So that's some types of simulation tests that we sometimes use at the law firm. Not mentioned in the book is the idea of provisional hiring, using a 90-day or shorter provisional hiring period in which the applicant is employed on trial with the expectation that if performance is acceptable at the time, then employment will be permanent. Otherwise, the employee is not hired permanently and another candidate is given a shot at the job. Avoiding employee regret. How do you make sure that the employee who comes on board is happy and fits in well? You might want to give the candidate an RJP, a realistic job preview. Having the HR personnel or an actual worker in a similar job discuss with the candidate considered for hiring both the positive and negative features of the job. That can avoid unrealistic expectations of the new employee, who is less likely to become disillusioned and quit later on if they're given too rosy a picture before they're hired. Want it to be real and accurate. And then there are some features of many jobs which aren't the most pleasant, but for the right person who can deal with them, that's how you find out it's a good fit. Training employees in needed skills and knowledge. And the book discusses both orientation and training. So, orientation being introducing a new employee to the job and organization, and training being a learning experience that seeks a relatively permanent change in employees by improving their ability to perform a job. So, with orientation, you can have job orientation, work unit orientation, orientation toward the group, organization orientation, learning about the culture and the overall organization, its mission and goals. The goal is to change the new employee from an outsider to an insider, making the new employee feel comfortable and fairly well adjusted within the organization. Hopefully, they're already fairly well adjusted as a person, or perhaps you've made the wrong hire. It can also lower the likelihood of poor work performance, and it reduces the likelihood of a quick turnover if the new worker becomes isolated and frustrated and feels like they're still an outsider. Note the importance nowadays of social and digital HR. That helps with both orientation and training. And quite frankly, a lot of training now is done with either Zoom calls or reviewing material that's available, either internally produced or purchased from consultants and vendors to assist in job training and orientation. And also to assist with compliance. All the compliance and ethical materials that you'll see nowadays are also often done today digitally. And note the various training methods in the seventh exhibit in the unit. I think that's important to review as well. Retaining competent, high-performing employees. Performance management systems, and then also compensating employees' pay and benefits. So, a performance management system, that's a system that establishes performance standards that are to be used to evaluate employee performance. Specific performance appraisal methods, there's many of them: written essays, critical incidents, adjective rating scales, bars, MBO. We'll talk about that later. That's an important topic. 360-degree appraisal, multi-person performance appraisals, and there are advantages and disadvantages listed, and you can see that in the book. With compensating employees, pay and benefits, you want to have an effective and appropriate compensation system, and also understand that not everyone is motivated just by more money. That's sometimes if you pay employees too much, you can have negative results. You can create problems. Factors determining compensation and benefits. Exhibit number 9 in the unit. That's also a little too busy. It's got too many squiggles and arrows and that sort of thing to really, at least for me, to comprehend with my simple mind. Employee benefits, those are important rewards beyond the stated pay. That can be vacation, health care, retirement contributions, and for the C-suite, a lot more. And it's often tax advantaged. Note the 3 approaches to multi-person comparison: group order, individual ranking, and paired comparison. This is different ways to maybe consider who's doing the best in your groups, in your work units. Note the actions managers can take when performance isn't up to standards. Reassignment, training, counseling, or discipline, including as much as firing. Almost all of us today work to have money, but money alone doesn't motivate all of us. Uh, and as I mentioned just a minute ago, overcompensating can cause employees to lose focus. They become focused on their pay as opposed to the function. Pay systems can become skill based or variable based on performance. But again, be careful about creating incentives that allow employees to increase their pay, but create adverse problems like the Wells Fargo example, where they incentivized the bank employees to cross sell, but they didn't put important guidelines and guardrails in there to keep the bank employees from doing it in a wrong and, in fact, illegal way. Primary determinant of pay is the type of job an employee performs. Rank and file workers are typically hourly or salaried. There's a system called management by objectives, MBO, that's performance based. Executives typically have lots of pay. It's very creative. It's often tied to the overall performance of the organization for the C-suite, the CEO, CFO, COO, CIO, C-level executives. Employee benefits are worthy of a whole course. I actually took 2 courses in employee benefits in the LLM program at Georgetown. It's very technical and complicated field, and the top experts are probably the smartest tax lawyers and also perhaps the nerdiest tax lawyers in the world. Contemporary HRM issues that face today's managers, downsizing, which has legal and ethical issues, outplacement programs, and doing it. That's a way to do it right. You'll see many major corporations, if they do have to downsize or restructure, get rid of some old, possibly bring in a few new, they will spend a lot of time outplacing employees, and it helps because, of course, the cost of doing it wrong is so high. If you have EEOC issues or other challenges to layoffs, wrongful termination issues, National Labor Relations Board gets involved. You can end up with having to pay back pay many years later for employees that you thought you were done with, and that can be quite expensive and also damaging to the organization, not just financially but also in terms of morale. And also understand that there is a psychological condition that has been identified in organizational behavior called layoff survivor syndrome. And that's the damage to the morale and the mental health of the people who survive the layoff. They feel guilty, just like survivors of an accident, a major tragedy, feel guilty. People who come back with PTSD from having seen their buddies on the battlefield being killed and feel guilty because they survived. Why did they survive when their buddy was killed? So that happens in business too, and can be quite traumatic. Note sexual harassment issues, the Me Too movement. The EEOC gets involved with claims of sexual harassment. Note Title VII policies and cultures and the importance of having a system to respond to and appropriately handle incidences of sexual harassment on the job. And then note the dynamic of the changing workforce, the work-life balance programs, family-friendly benefits, and contingent jobs. There is a new unit in your book, which I have posted in the course materials on diversity and inclusion in case you're using the 10th edition of the textbook. This unit discusses workforce diversity. These are ways in which people in a workforce are similar and different from one another in terms of gender, age, race, sexual orientation, ethnicity, cultural background, physical abilities, and disabilities. Types of diversity can include race, ethnicity, age, gender, ability, religion, LGBTQ identification, or other. HRM and diversity inclusion, we have both legal requirements and then we also have ethical standards and organizational culture. And the topic of inclusion, which involves fair and respectful treatment and a welcoming culture. Consider checking out some 3 perspectives on diversity and inclusion programs, and I have these linked in my slides, and they're 3 YouTube videos that you can watch. And I think I looked at several of them, and I picked these as a smattering. I wanted to get several perspectives. One of the best ones I've ever seen is by Joan C. Williams, who is a very experienced law professor at the University of California, Hastings Law School in San Francisco. She's also a leading consultant to business on diversity programs and how to fix them if the programs are not fixing the problem. And her talk is called Why Corporate Diversity Programs Fail and What to Do Instead. And it was a TED Talk that she gave not too long ago, and it is available on YouTube. And it's only about 10 or 15 minutes long, and it's really, really useful. Then there's this really sweet program by Mary M. Elasser, who was a 9-year-old schoolgirl, I believe, called Diversity and Inclusion, Lessons in Friendship and Love. And this is a really surprising and delightful talk, and it's less than 10 minutes, maybe just 6 or 7, from another TED Talk from a young Muslim girl regarding diversity and inclusion in practice, even at a very young age. And then there's also a video that I've included by Thomas Sowell, the diversity delusion, which is critical of diversity training. And it's Professor Sowell is a professor at Stanford, and he has his own TV channel on YouTube. He's a academic critic of diversity programs. He's a fellow at a conservative think tank at Stanford. It's interesting to me that on what he posted, one of the longest parts of his interview was done by Charlie Rose, who was recently and famously fired by CBS and PBS. Yeah, he worked for both networks for a history of chronic sexual harassment of his coworkers. But I believe that these 3 short videos show 3 different perspectives on diversity and inclusion and will enrich your education and understanding of these topics and the critiques of it. So with that, that finishes up HRM in our book. And have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.